So I went out and saw the new Scream movie. I'd like to talk about it, but talking about just the new movie probably isn't a whole lot for one video. So how about I cover all five of the scary movies in the franchise? That'll be more substantial. Oh, and when I say cover, I mean spoil. So if you want, you can stop watching when I get to a movie you haven't seen. Anyway, first up is a movie lots of people have seen because it's like 25 years old. Let's talk about the original Scream. Yeah, I think this movie is a classic. It's the best movie in the franchise, and everyone knows that, but let me talk about why. I think there's several aspects of this movie that are just done better than any of the other movies. First, the characters. The original movie is the only one where I can call all the major characters memorable. Sidney Prescott is probably the best final girl in the horror genre. Dewey is super likable, so it's pretty fun to see him interact with Gale, who's not. Randy is a fan favorite, and the look behind you, Jamie scene is amazing. I love that. Even characters like Tatum or the principal, who get killed off, they're still memorable. Speaking of kills, this movie's killers, yeah, there's two, and I think that's a really cool twist in this first movie. They're Billy and Stu. Billy is a good villain, but Stu is just incredibly fun to watch in every scene. He's the reason the movie's so entertaining, actually. The finale of the movie takes place at Stu's house, and if you pause and look at the runtime, the finale actually takes up almost half the movie. Yet it still feels like an appropriate amount of time for a third act. I'm going to call that deceptively good pacing. The movie as a whole is paced very well. It has an engaging mystery from the moment we hear the phone ring in the iconic opening scene. I really like that we have to guess who the killer is. I frankly don't think a clumsy doofus in a costume is that scary of a threat, but the fact that we don't know who it is keeps it interesting. So yeah, this movie is excellent. A perfect example of a horror, comedy, mystery film that does basically everything right. It's a Scream, baby. So I think Scream 2, for the most part, is about as good as the original in terms of scares and comedy and mystery and the other stuff I mentioned. But I do have some major nitpicks, so let's get into those. I don't think the college setting is as interesting as a high school one. That's definitely a me thing, though. Like, I'm part of the generation whose end of high school lined up with the start of COVID times, and I'm always going to kind of feel like I didn't get as many memorable high school experiences as I could have. So when I watch movies that tell stories about memorable high school experiences, like the first Scream movie, I find it pretty interesting. College stories aren't as interesting to me because I'm currently in college, so I don't currently have that same kind of nostalgia that I do for high school. I don't know if any of that makes any sense, so I'll move on to an actual major nitpick. This movie kills off its interesting characters before its uninteresting characters. I have a few examples. First, one of the characters in this movie, Cece, is played by Daphne the Vampire Slayer, and I think she's pretty likable and interesting, but she's like the first one killed off. That's kind of whack. On the other hand, Sydney's new boyfriend, whose name I can't even remember, he survives until the third act for some reason. And of course, Randy dies about halfway through the movie. I actually don't have a problem with killing him off, but I would move his death to the end. Here's what I would do with more Randy screen time. One aspect of his character is that he has a crush on Sydney, so let's capitalize on that. So if Randy survives up until the third act, then Sydney's boyfriend can be the one who dies in the second act. Randy likes horror movies, he likes Sydney, and he was friends with the original killers, so that can make him now a prime suspect. Almost all the characters, including Sydney even maybe, think that he killed the boyfriend. So when the time comes for the third act, have Randy get stabbed by Ghostface while trying to protect Sydney, and then you can give those two a moment. Sydney can apologize for suspecting him, and then Randy gets to confess his feelings before he dies. I think if his death was later and he gets an emotional send-off instead of an unceremonious one, people wouldn't be so bummed about the fact that he gets killed off. But what do I know? Anyway, this Scream 2 section has mostly just been negative ramblings, so how about I end with a positive? This movie is actually where we meet the character of Cotton Weary, and I actually really like how he fits in the story. Initially, we don't trust him because Sidney doesn't trust him, but in the end, he saves the day and he gets to tell his story, and it's pretty nice. Cool. So yeah, Scream 2 is good, but I think it could maybe have been better. Scream 3 is a hot mess and I love it. Although there are scares, this one I think feels the least like a horror movie and the most like a comedy movie. And most of the comedy comes from the fact that I mainly enjoy this movie and all the silly things ironically. There are a couple things that I unironically do like though, so I'll mention those first. Once again, I like Cotton's role in the film. He's the one who gets killed off in the opening scene, and I think killing off a major character has a similar effect on audiences as killing off a character played by a well-known actor. Also, the fact that this film's villain kills the man who killed the killer last time makes this film's threat, in theory, more intimidating. Speaking of upping the stakes for the conclusion to a trilogy, I think Hollywood is a good choice for a setting, because the idea of the Scream franchise is that our heroes fight a killer who has taken their love of horror movies too far, so it makes sense that the conclusion to the franchise literally takes place where horror movies are made. Also, I personally have a soft spot for movies set in LA, so that scratched this itch. Anyway, let's move on to the stuff that I think is pretty goofy. So the killer is this guy called Roman Bridger, and I feel pretty confident saying that he's nobody's favorite ghost face. I like the idea that the director of a stab movie is pointing out the real-life kills, but almost nothing else works with this character. The magical any voice changer is completely ludicrous, and the idea to retcon him to be behind even the original murders is kind of stupid. Also, someone decided the best way to tackle Sydney's trauma over her dead mother was to give her an out-of-nowhere half-brother. Again, kind of stupid. Also with Sydney, she's supposed to be the main character, but it feels like she has a surprisingly low amount of screen time in this one. Much of the film instead focuses on the misadventures of Dewey and the Stab 3 cast. Almost none of the new characters here have any personality, but Parker Posey's Jennifer Jolie, complete exception. Her goofy antics get the biggest laughs of the movie. Lastly, I want to talk about two little cameos in this movie, because both are interesting. The Carrie Fisher one pokes some fun at her most iconic role, and I can't believe that Scream 3 of all movies has something to say about corruption in Hollywood. The other cameo is when Randy's sister, who we have not met before, plays a recording from her brother for the gang. I guess even the makers of Scream 3 knew that his character didn't get enough screen time before dying. The cameo itself is so funny to me. Randy just casually announces that he got laid off screen, and that Sydney, who's watching the video, is going to die because that conforms with the rules of horror threequels or whatever. What a Chad. So yeah, Scream 3 is pretty messy, but I still had fun with it. I think Scream 4 generally gets better as it goes along. What that means, though, is that this movie has the worst opening sequence in the franchise. Now, the opening to the original movie is freaking iconic, and I think because of that, all the sequels try and open with something memorable and unique. Scream 4 throws everything into the kitchen sink in its first moments, and it's too much. We see 3 different pairs of girls get killed, and it's just so repetitive that I can barely remember what girls were in a movie within a movie within the movie, and which ones were in a movie within the movie, and which ones were in the real world of the movie. I really don't think that the Scream franchise is too meta for its own good, but this scene is too meta, and it just didn't work for me at all. Fortunately, the movie is actually good from this point on. It's pretty cool to return to Woodsboro after some in-universe time has passed. I think most of the new characters are memorable. One standout is Kirby Reed. Scream movies always have at least one character that likes and is as knowledgeable about horror movies. Like the first trilogy had Randy, but for this movie, Kirby fills that role. Having a girl be the horror expert differentiates Scream 4 from its predecessors and keeps it fresh. So I like Kirby, but what about the old characters? I think they're pretty interesting in this movie too. Dewey is about the same, but he's sheriff now, which fits his seniority. Gail doesn't really have her fame anymore, so she's super interested in investigating the new murder spree. And lastly, Sydney is treated as a legend by the new characters, and I think this works really well with the theme of the film, which gets explored in the third act. I really love the ending of this film. First of all, we get a super tense scene where Kirby is put into a similar situation as the opening of Scream 1 and has to answer Ghostface's questions to save Charlie. These two just started being a new potential couple, but I was kind of invested in their romance. You can really see the panic Kirby's feeling, so it's a relief when she goes to untie Charlie from the chair. But then he stabs her because he's such a nice guy. He's one of the ghost faces, and it's soon revealed that the other one is Jill. I really like her motivation. She's fame hungry and wants to be a final girl just like her cousin. It's like the horror version of Mysterio from Spider-Man Far From Home wanting to fake being a superhero. And just like how he was so fun to watch when he showed his true colors, Jill is just so compelling to watch when she's hurting herself trying to pretend she just survived a Ghostface attack instead of perpetrated one. So she then gets defeated in the hospital with a defibrillator and a badass line from Sydney. The film closes with media reporters crediting Jill as a hero. I think that's a good way to close out the film, even if in-universe they probably were informed of what actually went down shortly after. So yeah, Scream 4 is pretty good, I think. So now we get to the new movie. I think this one's very good, so let's get into why. First of all, I absolutely adore the opening scene. It's very similar to the opening to the original movie, and experiencing it on the big screen was a delight. There are a couple differences that make it unique though. Ghostface, instead of asking questions about any old horror movies, asks about the in-universe Stab movies. This is really cool because the Stab movies are based on the plots of the Scream movies, so as a Scream fan, I knew the answers to Ghostface's questions, and this makes the scene super entertaining. One specific example is that the last question is again a trick question. In the original, the trick question is about the twist in Friday the 13th, but in this new one, the trick question is about the twist in the original Stab or Scream movie. No, Billy Loomis and Stu Macher were the killers. Another difference is that the girl in the opening scene, Tara, actually survives the opening with some injury, and she gets to be a fairly main character in the story. That's cool. So I mentioned Tara, and she's probably the best of this batch of new characters, but the rest aren't bad. Richie is pretty funny, and it's nice that another one of the characters is named after Wes Craven. I think for the most part, the legacy characters are also used well. It's revealed that new character Sam is the daughter of Billy Loomis, and I actually did not expect Skeet Ulrich to show up in the little flashback visions at all. That was a complete surprise. I think having a hero with villain parentage is interesting. Next, Dewey is noticeably older and more beat up from all the attacks over the years, and in this movie he finally ends up dying. I think he gets a nice send-off. Sydney has been through this a lot, and you can really feel that with Neve Campbell's performance. She acts older and wiser, almost like a protective mother figure. And then lastly, since a couple new characters are related to him, this movie does reference Randy, and I think for the most part his character is honored well also. There's a scene in the ending with his niece that's even more amazingly meta than his iconic scene in the original. I think I like it, even though it's a little weird that his relatives find enjoyment in watching movies where the character based on him gets killed. I don't know. Speaking of the ending, I'm happy with the choice of killers, I think. Richie being a killer is definitely supposed to be disappointing, and Amber being a killer was actually foreshadowed well now that I think about it. I figure I shouldn't complain too much because a major theme of this film is toxic fandom when it comes to belated sequels. Okay, so yeah, the newest Scream movie does most everything pretty well. I think if there's more sequels, I'll probably like them. I think overall, the Scream franchise is an enjoyable one. It has good characters and a good mix of comedy, mystery, and horror. I'm glad I got into this franchise, and I'm glad I got to make this little video to share my thoughts.